That working? Can you guys hear me? Fantastic. Well, yeah, for those of you I've not met, my name is Ollie. I work for a church in central London where I live with my wife, Katie, and a tiny hamster that I love more than I love most of my closest colleagues and friends. When I was a student, I studied maths up in Durham, and now I work alongside university students like yourselves because I am convinced that Jesus is good news for students today. And that's why I'm here with you, because I'm convinced that Jesus is good news for students, and the Christian Union has invited me to talk a bit about that, why Jesus is good news, and what difference he might make to your life as a student in Southampton in 2023. Our title for this evening is Finding Freedom When Everything Feels Unfair. Is there such a thing as justice? And I want to ease us into what might be quite a weighty topic by beginning by thinking a bit about that feeling itself, about justice and injustice and how those things make us feel. A few weeks ago, Katie and I went over to our friend's house for a cup of tea. And as we walked into their living room, we couldn't not notice a 3-tier Victoria sponge cake, smothered in butter icing, sprinkled liberally with white chocolate and strawberries, and enclosed under a dome of glass. We weren't the only ones to notice it. Their 3-year-old Boaz was hypnotized, and not the sort of hypnotized where you are standing still. The sort of hypnotized where you are losing your mind. His trucks had been thrown across the room, his hands were tightly fisted, and his cheeks were flushed pink and streaming with tears. And honestly, Southampton, I had sympathy for him. I love cake, Boaz loves cake, and we were in the presence of cake. But Boaz had been told by his mum that he was allowed one small slice of cake, and he was absolutely devastated because, in his words, I don't want a small slice of cake, I want a big slice of cake. The feeling of injustice was big in his heart, big in his lungs, until later that evening he took matters quite literally into his own hands and was found with both fists plunged into the buttercream. We all know from a young age how things feel when they feel unfair. Our hearts beat harder, our fists get tighter, our cheeks flush, and our breath starts to catch in our throats. Maybe you recognize that feeling from the small moments in your life when things didn't go the way you wanted them to. Or maybe you recognize it from the much, much bigger ways in which you have faced systematic and oppressive injustice. It is a horrible feeling. It is an all-consuming feeling. And it's a feeling that each one of us in this room will recognize to varying degrees. But perhaps we're not quite as quick to put a name to the opposite feeling. We know how things feel when everything feels unfair, but what does justice feel like? And I don't just mean the catharsis that comes when injustices are corrected. I don't just mean the feeling of vindication and relief when what's wrong is put right. I mean the feeling of justice itself. What does it feel like to be in a world where everything is just right? There's actually a word in English to describe that sort of world, but it's a word that isn't as popular as it used to be. And it's the word righteous. The word comes from combining the word right and the word bounteous. Literally, if something is righteous, it means that it is bounteous with rightness. If we ever use it today, it's normally in a derogatory way, describing somebody as a bit self-righteous, a bit holier than thou. So here's my effort to describe how that sort of word should feel to us. And it begins with Harry Potter. I'm a millennial, which means I have strong opinions about Hogwarts houses. So I want you to put your hand up if you have a favorite Hogwarts house. Put your hand up if you're one of those people. Okay, now keep your hand up if your favorite house is Hufflepuff. Okay, those of you who've kept your hands up are correct. The rest of you try better next time. Hufflepuff is clearly the best house, and if you want proof, simply ask this question: which Hogwarts house is represented by a badger? And you will quickly reach the correct conclusion. When I was at uni, I did a module called Harry Potter and the Age of Illusion, because I went to Durham and we take ourselves even less seriously than other people take us. And the opening lecture for Harry Potter and the Age of Illusion takes place in the great medieval banqueting hall of Durham Castle. You were expected to wear a gown, and upon entering the great hall of Durham Castle in your gown, you would be met by 8 wooden tables, 4 plain wooden tables at the back and 4 tables at the front, decked out in the colours red, green, blue, and yellow. Gryffindor, Slytherin, Ravenclaw, and Hufflepuff. The professor stood at the front, robed in red, with a stuffed owl perched on his shoulder and an upturned sorting hat in his hands. And one by one, he would bellow out your name, beckoning you towards him. It was the longest walk of my life, as he called out Ollie Lansdowne before plunging his hand into the sorting hat and slowly unfurling a coloured marble. Time stood still as I awaited my fate. Hufflepuff. And Southampton, in that moment, everything just felt right. This is not a perfect analogy, but I think if you were to take that feeling where everything just feels right and magnify it many, many, many times over, then you might just arrive at something resembling what righteousness is meant to feel like to us. Justice and rightness are bounteous. Over the course of this evening, we're going to have time for discussion around tables. We're doing that because at the CU, we value honest conversations about things that really matter. And here are the first couple of questions I want you to discuss around your tables. First, what's your earliest memory of injustice? Second, how would you flesh out the way that justice and injustice feel? And third, how would you begin to define justice and injustice? 4 or 5 minutes on our tables to discuss those questions. Do you want to draw that conversation back in there? We probably all know the flushed face, hot cheeks feeling of injustice. To varying degrees, each of us will have experienced that feeling for ourselves. And when we start to think about it, we can probably describe the feeling of justice too, that feeling when everything is just right, just as it's meant to be. But my question for us is injustice only a feeling? Because I don't know about you, but sometimes it can feel like how things are meant to be has ever and will ever only exist in my imagination. Is there really such a thing as justice, or is it just injustice all the way down? Infinite variations on unfairness without there actually being anything that's really right or just or good. The more you've experienced injustice yourself, the more pressing that question will become. Firstly, because the more you've experienced injustice, the more you'll need injustice to be more than a feeling. But secondly, because the more you've experienced injustice, the more you might begin to doubt that justice is anything more than wishful thinking. When each new day brings fresh pain along with it, it can be hard not to lose confidence that justice even exists at all. In a world so cruel, so unjust, and so riddled with wrong, does right really exist anywhere except in our imaginations? Is there such a thing as justice? Or is it all just an illusion? To which I want to say, possibly. That is one plausible explanation, and we can't totally rule that out. It is possible that justice is a mere illusion and that the strength of our feelings about injustice, well, those are evidence that there isn't such a thing as justice after all. But that isn't the only possible explanation. And even though it is logically coherent as an explanation, I'm not actually sure that it's the most reasonable explanation either. It is possible that justice is an illusion, but if justice is merely an illusion, well, then it is worth noticing that that means injustice is an illusion as well. If justice and fairness are figments of our imagination, well, then so are injustice and inequality and abuse. There can be no right or wrong in that sort of universe. There can only be is or is not. Do you see what's happening? What this explanation does is just explain away everything that you can't touch as merely an illusion. To be fair, it is one valid way of interpreting the evidence, but it's the sort of interpretation that explains everything away by making my experience the full measure of reality. It's a way of saying that because my life is bad, there must be no such thing as good. And even though it is coherent, I'm not sure it actually makes a huge amount of sense. To call justice an illusion because there's so much injustice makes about as much sense, to me at least, as saying there's no such thing as hot because you're cold. When you follow it through to its logical conclusion, I think it actually eventually turns into some sort of cosmic gaslighting. It ends up saying everything you care about, well, that's an illusion that exists solely in your head. Look, maybe this all feels a bit abstract, so let me open this idea up a bit further by sharing a story. And it's a story about one of my biggest heroes in life, a woman called Rachel Den Hollander. Rachel was the lead witness in the case against the now convicted child molester Larry Nassar, raising her voice against evil when she thought the world might not listen. Because as a teenager, Rachel experienced the sort of thing that causes you to doubt everything you thought you knew. Larry Nassar was the doctor for Team USA's Olympic gymnasts, a world-renowned medical professional at the very peak of his career. Rachel was an amateur gymnast who was given the opportunity to be treated by Larry Nassar, and during those visits, Nassar repeatedly abused her under the guise of medical therapy. Abuse by a world-famous medical professional, well, that's the sort of trauma that can cause you to deconstruct everything that you once thought was solid. And in her memoir, Rachel records what happens when she did that. She recalls sitting down to journal the things that she knew to be true. She drew 2 big circles. In the first one, she wrote a title. What do I know is true and real? Number 1, there is such a thing as right and wrong. Let me read what she writes. She writes, I knew those 2 things existed, not just in people's minds, but really and truly existed. People could look at evil like the Holocaust, murder, or sexual assault and know it was wrong. We didn't have to base our conclusions on what someone else thought. What did she write next? Number 2, there is a God who defines good and evil. Here's how she explained her logic. Either truth was in some form dependent on human ideas, which meant that good and evil were subject to opinion, or the definition of good and evil came from someone higher than human beings. She goes on, there had to be a God. And here's the bit I think we really need to pay attention to. Let me read the paragraph. In the mid-afternoon sun, the green of the new leaves was as vibrant as I'd ever seen. I looked at the 2 things I had written, and there is nowhere else to go. If there is no God and no real good and evil, I can't even call what Larry did to me wrong. Not really. Not if right and wrong are only constructs of human opinion. Do you see her argument? What happened to Rachel Den Hollander was evil, but she can only really say that it was evil if right and wrong exist in the real world, defined by something or someone higher than us, something higher than human opinion. 10 years later, in her victim impact statement at Larry Nassar's sentencing, she reflected more widely on what gave her that confidence. She said, "Throughout this process, I have clung to a quote by C.S. Lewis, where he says, 'My argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how did I get this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he first has some idea of straight. What was I comparing the universe to when I called it unjust?'" She then turned to her abuser, Larry, and said the following. She said, "Larry, I can call what you did evil and wicked because it was. And I know it was evil and wicked because the straight line exists. The straight line is not measured based on your perception or anyone else's perception. And this means I can speak the truth about my abuse without minimization or mitigation. And I can call it evil because I know what goodness is. And this is why I pity you. Because when a person loses the ability to define evil, they can no longer define and enjoy what is truly good." Do you see how that argument works? According to Rachel, what happened to her and to hundreds of other girls at the hands of that gymnastics doctor, well, it isn't evidence that there's no such thing as right and wrong. It's actually the exact opposite. It's evidence that there is definitely such a thing as evil, and so there must be such a thing as good. Look, it is possible that the intense feeling of injustice that each one of us has experienced is evidence that there is no such thing as right and wrong. But I find Rachel's explanation much more plausible. I think the much more plausible explanation is that injustice hurts so much because injustice really is wrong, and even our fists and our cheeks know that. So what do you think? Here's my next set of questions for you to discuss on your tables. Firstly, do you think injustice is more than a feeling? Why or why not? And secondly, where do you think we should look to define what is right and wrong? 4 or 5 minutes on our tables to discuss those questions. Do you want to draw that thought to a close there? It is possible that the intense feeling of injustice that we've all experienced is evidence that there is no such thing as right and wrong. But I think there's a much more plausible explanation. I think the much more plausible explanation is that injustice hurts so much because injustice really is wrong. And we know that in our minds, in our hearts, in our fists, and even in our cheeks. And I reckon that's one of the reasons why we don't actually only feel that sense of unfairness when we are given less than we deserve. Sometimes we even feel that sense of unfairness when we take much more than we deserve. Our cheeks flushing and our hearts thumping, not because we deserve more than we've been given and we feel outraged, but because we deserve a lot less than we've taken and we feel quite a lot of guilt. Injustice must be more than a feeling because we don't just feel the pang of injustice when we are on the receiving end of it. Often we feel that pang of injustice when we're the ones handing it out too, at least until we learn to suppress that inner sense of right and wrong. And it's at this point, as we think about how often human beings have taken much more than we deserved, that we might start to see that the problem of injustice is actually much bigger than whether or not justice is real. There's actually an even bigger problem that we need to face, and it's this one. Is justice even possible? Because there have been a lot of people in history who have taken more than they deserved, and very often they did it by promising something that they couldn't actually deliver. There have been a lot of people in history who have promised to give the world justice if we gave them power. And rarely, if ever, have they proven that they deserved the power we gave them. History is littered with people and movements who promised justice in return for power and then clung to power without ever bringing about meaningful justice. It's a damning indictment on human history that the societies in which there has been the least injustice have tended to be the societies in which power has been the least concentrated in any one group of people. And even that damning indictment doesn't actually help us find much of a solution because, well, equality might help bring about justice, but you can only enforce equality from a position of superiority. And you can't redistribute power without first taking all that power for yourself. I think that paradox gets to the heart of one of the most peculiar and actually paradoxical features of contemporary politics, especially amongst our generation. Today in the UK, I reckon we put more hope in our government to fix all of our problems than we have done for generations. And at the very same time, we have less faith in our government to fix any of our problems than we have had for generations. We want the government to fix all our problems, but we are deeply and rightly suspicious of anyone who would be willing to take that much power. So is justice really possible? Humanity has a long history of grieving injustice and then taking matters into our own hands. But if we're honest, are we really willing to say that our hands are any cleaner than the hands that came before us? We're going to spend some time talking about that on our tables now, and here are the questions I want us to discuss. Do you think justice is actually possible? And if you were going to trust a person or group of people with bringing about justice, what questions would you want to ask them first? 4 or 5 minutes on our tables to discuss those questions. Should we draw that back in there? Humanity has a long history of grieving injustice and then taking matters into our own hands. But whenever we take matters into our own hands, if we're honest with ourselves, well, then I think we'll be forced to admit that our hands are just as dirty as the hands that came before us. So we're still stuck with this question: is justice actually possible? If we look through the whole history of human beings, we'd struggle, I think, to say anything except no. But I want to propose this evening that there is one human being who stands out from the crowd. There is one human being who took less than he deserved and who gave out better than he was given. We're at a Christian Union event, so it won't surprise you that that person is Jesus Christ. And I want to read us something that he once said. In the middle of your tables, you find books like this. They're copies of John's Gospel, and we have those in English as well as in traditional and simplified Chinese. In the English version, it is on page 32 that I want us to turn. And in the traditional Chinese one, which looks like this, that's on page 50. John chapter 10, the big number 10 on page 32 in the English version, and the little 11 right at the bottom. And once you've found that, maybe give me a big smile so I know you can see it. Thank you. John chapter 10, big 10, little 11, verse 11, page 32. Jesus said the following, 2 short sentences. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Let me read that one more time. Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. In these 2 short sentences, we see in the words of Jesus a world in which justice is possible, and we see how justice is possible. And he does that by telling us something about us and something about him. First, something about us, which is that humanity is very sheep-like. And if you've ever spent any time around sheep, well, then you will know this is not a compliment. Because the sheep is not an animal renowned for its wisdom or its courage or its strength. The sheep is an animal renowned for how rarely it thinks for itself, how frequently it gets lost, how vulnerable it is to danger, and how hugely it overreacts when it is startled. And those things, I reckon, are all connected, because sheep spend their lives thinking about what is immediately in front of them, moving from one patch of grass to the next, oblivious to the world around them, until at some point they realize they are a long way from the place that they're meant to be. And they are face to face with dangers that they are powerless to withstand, at which point they freak out, panic, and get themselves into even more problems. Being superior human creatures, maybe we take offense at the idea that we are very sheep-like. But perhaps if we're willing to think about it for a little bit longer, then maybe we'll admit that it is possible that humans have a tendency to become fixated on what is immediately in front of us, oblivious to the world around us, until at some point, well, we notice that we are a long way from where we're meant to be, and we're face to face with dangers we're powerless to withstand and have been startled into solutions that are actually only making the problem worse. Jesus thinks humans are very sheep-like, and I think he might have a point. Humanity is very sheep-like because there's a place where we belong, a world in which everything is as it's meant to be, a world of green pastures and quiet waters, but we keep going astray, following our appetites for what is immediately in front of us and getting lost. And now we are a long way from that place, and we have found ourselves in all sorts of trouble we are powerless to withstand, trouble that in our panic we are liable to make much worse, because we were so happy to be influenced by people who don't actually have our best interests at heart. This is not a flattering picture, but it isn't unsympathetic either. And it seems to me that Jesus' description of humanity actually makes a lot of sense of the unjust world in which we find ourselves. We are sheep who are lost in a world more full of troubles than we are full of wisdom or courage or strength to face them. First, something about human beings. We are very sheep-like. And now second, something about Jesus, which is that he is the good shepherd we need. Let me read that verse again for us. Look down on page 32. Verse 11, at the bottom of page 32, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Do you know the whole story of the first 2/3 of the Bible? Well, it echoes the story, really, of the whole of human history. It's a story in which we are waiting for someone to shepherd humanity in justice and righteousness. Someone to be the one who could shepherd us back into the green pastures we were made for. And every single person who steps up to that task just massively fails. They take advantage of the sheep. They flee in the face of danger. And the people are left harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Until eventually, Well, eventually, God promises that he is going to come down and be for himself the shepherd that we need. Which means when Jesus describes himself as the good shepherd in John chapter 10, well, it's worth observing he is making a very, very big claim. Jesus is claiming here that he is the God who made you and has come down to shepherd you. He's claiming that he is the God who defines what's right and what's wrong, the God who has come down to shepherd us back into the world of righteousness for which we were made. Jesus is telling us that a just world is possible because he is the good shepherd who can lead us there if we are willing to follow his voice. And he doesn't just tell us he's the good shepherd and expect us to take his word for it. Did you notice he offers proof? We talked earlier about what questions we might ask before trusting someone to deliver justice. What sort of leader would you hand yourself over to? What sort of hands would you trust your life with? Well, Jesus doesn't just tell us to trust him. He doesn't just tell us he's the good shepherd. He offers us proof, and it's this. He is the sort of good shepherd who will lay down his life for the sheep. He doesn't take advantage of his sheep. He will never abandon them, and he will never flee in the face of danger. He won't, and he didn't, because he is the good shepherd who laid down his life for his sheep. And on the cross, as Jesus died in our place with nails piercing his hands and his feet, Jesus was true to his promise. History is littered with people and movements who promised justice in return for power and then clung to power without ever bringing about meaningful justice. But Jesus died praying for the forgiveness of the people killing him. Friends, that is a revolutionary concept. That is the only kind of justice that moves beyond dictators playing king of the hill. Absolute power, exercised in unconditional love to deliver perfect justice. Friends, if you know that you are very sheep-like, then Jesus is the good shepherd that you and I need. And on the cross, as he died, he proved it. Jesus died praying for forgiveness for those killing him, and not just for them. He died praying for forgiveness for you. Which means that the hands that Jesus holds out towards us are hands that were broken and bled for us. The feet that promised to lead us home are feet that were pierced to save us. And he teaches his followers to do like he did, to love our enemies, to bless those who curse us, and to pray for those who mistreat us. Because the only kind of justice that is possible is the kind of justice that extends mercy when none should be found. We're going to take a couple of minutes to discuss that in our groups, and here's the questions that I've got for us. What do you make of the idea that humanity is very sheep-like? What stands out to you about Jesus from what you've heard about him? And what questions have you been left with this evening? 3 or 4 minutes to discuss those questions on our tables. Should we draw that back in there? Is there such a thing as justice? That's the question we began with this evening. And it is possible that intense feeling of injustice that we've all experienced is evidence that there is no such thing as right and wrong. But I think there's a much more plausible explanation. I think the much more plausible explanation is that injustice hurts so much because injustice really is wrong, and we know that in our minds, in our hearts, in our fists, and in our cheeks. Humanity has a long history of grieving injustice and then taking matters into our own hands. But whenever we take matters into our own hands, if we're honest with ourselves, well, we'll be forced to admit that our hands are just as dirty as the hands that came before us. But friends, Jesus' hands are different. Jesus tells us that we are like lost sheep and that he is the good shepherd we're hopelessly lost without. The God who defines justice come down to deliver justice. The God who made us come down to shepherd us back home. He confirmed who he is by laying down his life for his sheep, which means the hands he holds out to you are hands that were broken and bled for you. And there's one more way that he says we are like sheep and he is like our shepherd. He says we're like sheep and he's like a shepherd because if we listen to him, well, then we'll recognize his voice. So I would just love to invite you to do that, to listen to Jesus' voice by reading his story, to see for yourself whether you recognize the voice of the Good Shepherd who is calling you home. As I said, these Gospels in the middle of your tables are first century eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life. We have them in English as well as both simplified and traditional Chinese, and they're our gift from us to you this evening. They won't take more than 2 hours to read, and what I'd suggest is putting a tick next to things you liked, a cross next to things you didn't, and a question mark next to things that confused you, so that you can then meet up with a friend from the Christian Union and discuss what you made of it. If you reach into the middle of your table, you'll find cards that look like this. Can you just reach into the middle and wave those to me so that I know that we have them? Fantastic, thank you. Hopefully you can each get one. You can use these to let us know what you thought of this evening and to let us know if you are someone who'd be up for meeting up to chat further. So I'm going to be giving us a bit of time to be honest on those cards, and then in 30 seconds or so, Josh and Millie are going to pop up and let us know what's happening next. So thank you so much for listening, and now 30 seconds to a minute to fill in these cards as honestly as we feel able.